Our psalm for this morning coincides with Yom Ha'atzmaut. Today is Israel's Independence Day. Israel at the age of 73. And this Psalm 122 is a love poem to Israel, specifically to Jerusalem. And in that regard is well chosen. As you'll see in a moment, I'll read the psalm. The psalm speaks to Jerusalem as if Jerusalem is alive, a place that is, in this context, a lover, a place whose aliveness is intertwined with the people that Jerusalem has a relationship with. The anthropomorphism of place goes back to the early writings. Homer, the Greek of the 6th century before the Common Era, the author of Homer and the Odyssey and the Iliad, will describe an island who gives a speech. And in honor of my mother-in-law, a Chicago native, there is Carl Sandburg, who died in 1967, who would describe Chicago as the city of big shoulders. Here's another example that I like of Jack Kerouac, the great writer, who says, Paris, writing in A Lonesome Traveler, Paris is a woman, but London is an independent man puffing his pipe in a pub. And so there is a literary continuity of describing a place in personal, human-like terms. But what is distinctive, or at least more accentuated in this psalm and in books like the Book of Lamentations, the Book of Eicha, in which Jerusalem as a place longs for her children who have been dispersed from her in that first destruction of the temple in 586 before the Common Era. And so as I read Psalm 122, you will hear the psalmist addressing Jerusalem as you, speaking to Jerusalem, both recalling the past of the place as a pilgrim now in Jerusalem, and also looking to the future with prayer and blessing. With that, let me read Psalm 122, and then, as is our way, I'll go back through it and I will point out some of the key questions. When was it written? What is the nature of the construction? And most importantly, how do these words resonate for us as we make the words our own? In my opportunity to translate the psalm, the title is a bit original. Usually the line in Psalm 1 is, "Let us go to the house of Adonai," but I translated it more as the words are presented. House of Adonai, Beit Adonai, Nelech, let us go. And I gained a little bit more confidence to do so in that this image of let us go to Jerusalem has another place in Hebrew scripture, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3. Va'amru, and they said, V'na'aleh el har Adonai, let us go up to the house of God, el Beit Elohai He Yaakov, to the house of the God of Jacob. And then if you go ... in that same verse, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah, for out of Zion comes Torah, udvar Adonai mi Yerushalayim, the word of God from Jerusalem, which we say when we hold the Torah. But there, the grammatical order of the words is Na'ale el har Adonai, let us go to the mountain of God. And here it's Beit Adonai, the house of God, let us go. All right. The title, taken from that opening phrase, as a pilgrimage psalm. House of Adonai, let us go. A song of ascents for David. I rejoiced when they said to me, House of Adonai, let us go. Standing are our feet within your gates, Jerusalem. Jerusalem rebuilt is like a city that is joined to her altogether. For there they went up, tribes of Yah, a testimony for Israel, to give thanks to the name of Adonai. For there sat thrones of judgment, thrones of the house of David. Let them ask for the peace of Jerusalem. May they find tranquility who love you. May peace be within your walls and tranquility in your palaces. For the sake of my siblings and friends, I will speak now. Peace be within you. For the sake of the house of Adonai our God, I seek good for you. After that long psalm of earlier this week, 176 verses of Psalm 119, I'm finding a short psalm of 9 verses. I'm just, relaxed. So from the beginning, here's some things to note about construction. From verses 4 till verse 7, there's kind of a doublet image, right? So you'll find, for they went up, tribes, a testimony for Israel, and then to give thanks to the name of Adonai, for there sat thrones of judgment, thrones of the house of David. So that kind of couplet is what we saw in yesterday's psalm. It's not uncommon in poetry of this time. But here's the thing that's kind of lovely, and that is verses 1 to 3, the beginning of the psalm, do not have couplets. It's as if the psalmist is eager to move forward. There's that sense of, momentum. And then in Jerusalem, the couplets begin as the psalmist on pilgrimage reflects backwards, recalls the past, which is the nature of verses 4 and 5, and then is shifting to looking to the future, the present with verse 6 and 7, and then, if you will, prayers that also point to the future. When was this psalm written? Well, of course, as we've learned, you don't know. You don't know in terms of its original context or where it was written. Benjamin Siegel, who I so rely on in his commentary of literary analysis, he would say that verse 4 gives a clue. For there they went up, tribes of Yah, a testimony for Israel to give thanks to the name of Adonai. Well, the first possibility, it was written after the dispersion of the 10 tribes, the year 722, but before 586, which is the destruction of the first temple. Here's why he says that, because there's still a sense of being a community that was composed of tribes, though the only time in which all the tribes would have gone up to Jerusalem was during the reign of Solomon. It is Solomon who built the temple, which means this psalm was not written before King Solomon, meaning the time of David, because there was no temple yet. Though medieval Bible commentators like Radak, Spain, 13th century, will say King David composed this psalm to be sung by the choir when the temple would be built. by his son Solomon. Back to the dating. And so here there's this image of tribes and tribes. So it could have been written in the time of the first temple. Some say it was written during the first temple, but closer to the time of Josiah. Josiah was a king who we identify with the finding of the book of Deuteronomy, roughly in the year 621 before the Common Era, because at that point, it's only really in the book of Deuteronomy that Jerusalem becomes central. So Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 4 to 6, for the first time we get the command that unlike the people of Canaan, all the offerings are to be brought to one place, a designated location, which will become Jerusalem. And later in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 8 to 9, again, part of this King Josiah Reformation and re-centralization of Jerusalem as capital, there's a description that there too, by the temple, will disputes be resolved. So the second possibility is it was written, first temple, but not at the time closer to Solomon, but closer to the time or even after King Josiah. The third is that it was written with the rebuilding of the second temple. The Israelites will come back 586, the temple is destroyed within 70 years. Cyrus invites the exiles of Babylonia to return, and here is the sense of a rebuilt Jerusalem. In fact, Yerushalayim Habnuyah, Jerusalem, which I translate as rebuilt in verse 3, is what we say these days. Namely, we say of Jerusalem, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. But now that Israel exists, in the modern state, people have added the words that are here as part of verse 3, Yerushalayim Habnuyah. May it be rebuilt, not just to be there, but may Jerusalem be rebuilt. The last comment in terms of when it was written or what is the time frame is, again, for so many of the readers of this psalm who lived in exile, Alshich and Radak, this is looking not to the present of a pilgrim, but to a future pilgrim, a messianic future, when all will be regathered in Jerusalem. And so in sum, we don't know when it was written, but what we do know is that it is about Jerusalem and a love for Jerusalem. And so now to start over again and to point out some key construction elements. What we know in the poetry of the Bible is that repetition of words signify key theme. The key words that are each repeated 3 times are the word Jerusalem, God's intimate name, Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, and the word Bayit, home, referring to God, referring to the temple. And so that's the trajectory. And as we go back now through this psalm again, what you're going to see as you look more carefully is that the verses go back and forth between a focus on the place and on the people, as if place and people are connected, intertwined, and there will be double entendres throughout, pointing to both God's word and place, God's house, and the people who come, who gather in Jerusalem. So from the beginning, a song of ascents for David, that introduction, is probably not part of the original composition, but organized later, as this is the third of 15 of psalms given this title, Song of Ascents, that would later be identified as pilgrim songs. I rejoice. Now, here's the only place where the I comes out. It begins with the psalmist, begins with samachti. I was happy. I rejoiced. Be'omrim li, when they said to me, and it's not clear who the they are. Could have been other neighbors, other potential pilgrims who say to him, as if the idea didn't come from himself. He didn't initiate, but was so eager. House of Adonai, Beit Adonai, Nelech, let us go. And then there's like a gap between verses 1 and 2 in my translation. That's to say, in Hebrew, as we know, there's only two tenses. Perfect, which is present to past, and imperfect, present to the future. Well, this is perfect. So it can either be read as standing in the present, or because of the nature of the grammar, King James Version and many of the translations will actually put it in another context. Our feet shall stand within thy gates. As if he is now imagining everything before he goes. So that's possible. But the way I experience the psalm and choose to translate is that between verses 1 and 2, he has gone on his pilgrimage, and with verse 2, he arrives. It's the liminal moment of being at the gates. Standing are our feet, and now the shift from the I to the our. He is part of community within the gates of Jerusalem, and now he surveys, or she surveys, the city. And again, Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, Habnuya, rebuilt or built again or simply built, is like a city, ki ir chubra la yachdav. And here the Hebrew is a bit hard to put together. I do it more literally. That is joined to her all together. And that, joined to her altogether, is unclear what that means. It can and is understood in a variety of ways. One, on the physical level. David was the first king. This city of Jerusalem was an ancient Canaanite city. In the Bible, we have the story, Genesis 14, verses 18 to 20, of Abraham. After his battle with the kings, he's greeted by a man, Melchizedek, who is called Melech Shalem, the king of Shalem, which the rabbis will understand as Yerushalayim. Modern scholars will say Shalem was a Canaanite god. And so Jerusalem, when King David conquered it, was a difficult fortress city to conquer, and he'll be the one who will make it his capital, Ir David, the city of David, and he will combine the hills. That's one way this is understood in terms of the physical. He'll make a city because Jerusalem is built on a variety of hills. Some say the little towns around Jerusalem became part of the capital for protection. Mind you, it's not King David, but only his son Solomon who will build the wall. But David will create a sense of cohesion as he asserts control. And some say that the term itself, chubra, verse 3, is an architectural term implying things that are built densely together. Literally, lechaber means to unite, and that it is a city that is, if you will, crowded together, all together, because it's a place that people want to be in. So that's the physical way, but the other is to understand it on a social level, that Jerusalem is the place of pilgrimage where people come together and unite. And so that is the poetic ambiguity of the phrase. Most translators don't bother to translate the la, the to her, but it's there. And my goal in this translation is to be, as is usually the case, more literal, to understand the poetry. And part of the poetry of verse 3 is ambiguity. And now the pilgrim remembers the past. He looks out at the city he's on or at the temple, and then he says, for there, as if he's pointing to the temple, they went up. Tribes of Yah, that shortened version name of God, the name of God that's identified with life, with breath. A testimony for Israel, Edut Yisrael. And here too, there's a wordplay. For they went up, a testimony for Israel. They went up on pilgrimage, testimony meaning a law for Israel. Or Edah also means community of Israel. So it can be they went up a community of Israel, or in response to a law for Israel. And that place and people, God and people, are all kind of double entendred throughout the psalm. To give thanks to the name of Adonai, which can also be to give praise. And then again pointing and remembering. For there, Sheshama, sat thrones of judgment, thrones of the house of David. And in the time of the temple, the Sanhedrin, the high court, would meet right next to the temple. Sanhedrin 88b in the Talmud will describe that meeting place as Lishchat Hagazit, the chamber of hewn stone. And in the second temple, when they no longer wanted to engage in capital punishment, they said that the court will no longer meet on the temple area, and therefore they will no longer be able to reach a verdict of capital punishment. And so, as you think of King Solomon, you think of Jerusalem and the king as a place of wise judgment. And Jerusalem, therefore, is both the house of David and the house of God. And the word in 5 of thrones or chairs is in the plural, kisot, to signify this dual purpose. And now a shift to prayer, looking both to the present, but now from the past to the future. May peace, before I get there, verse 6. Usually, overwhelmingly, the first word is translated as pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Sha'alu shalom Yerushalayim. But technically, the word sha'alu is let them ask. One of my translations, and only one in Mitsuda, translated as inquire for the peace. But King James Version, Art Scroll, always translate this, because of the context, as pray for the peace of Jerusalem. But let them ask is calling on the people to pray, but more, maybe to ask from each other. Again, I prefer leaving it literal to enable the double entendre of, is this speaking about what we should do with God or with each other? May they find tranquility who love you. And the you here, again, in Hebrew, there is no capitalization. Could be God, right? May they find tranquility who love you, particularly if you begin with the word pray. But as you will see, most likely the you, it's in the feminine. Ohavayich is in the feminine, is therefore referring to the place, to Jerusalem. And places in Hebrew are in the feminine. And so back to my introduction, This is a love poem and a conversation with Jerusalem as a living being. May peace be within your walls and tranquility in your palaces. And in my introduction, I have a couple of selections of melodies for verses by Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. I particularly love his melodies for verses 8 and 9. L'man achai v'rehai. For the sake of my and his brothers and sisters is how he does it. When he first sang or wrote the song, it was for my brothers and friends. And then as he became older, he changed it to do one verse as for my sisters and friends and went back and forth. But so it gets solved because it only appears once here. Achai, for the sake of my siblings and friends, for the sake of my kin and friends, I will speak now. Peace be within you. And here again, the double entendre. The you can be, which is the first and more obvious level. May it be within you, Jerusalem. For the sake of the house of Adonai our God, I seek good for you. But the you can also be the community of Israel. Either and both, because for Jerusalem, so evident in the book of Lamentations, the two are intertwined. That Jerusalem, and that is what's distinctive about this psalm, and about how Jerusalem is related to by the Jewish people. Every day, we traditionally prayed the Amidah, the standing prayer, 3 times a day, the 14th of the 19 blessings. Pray for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Every time we traditionally ate bread and had a meal, the Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, prayed Habonei Yerushalayim, may you rebuild Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was not just a place. Jerusalem was where we as a people experienced cohesion, a temple, a closeness to God, and longed for a rebuilding, but more. Jerusalem, as in this psalm, is a lover, is a living entity that is the vessel for not only the temple, but God's presence. Some of our commentators would say it is where heaven and earth met, and that blessings for the earth flowed through Jerusalem. Interestingly, Ir Shalom, a name for Jerusalem, the city of peace, did not begin to be the name until the 10th century, when Sadia Gaon, that master teacher born in Egypt, but who became the head of the academy in what is today Baghdad, the first to write a Siddur for the community then of Spain, he would coin the word Ir Shalom for Ir David, the city of David. But as I say, the word Shalem, which is in the Bible, may have a Canaanite origin, not related necessarily to Shalom. But in this psalm, there is in verse 3, Ir, and then we will get Shalom repeated in verses 6 and 7. Last comment in terms of the artistry, and then to pull this together. Listen to the repeated sounds. Verse 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, Shesham, Kishama. And now verse 6. Sha'alu, Shalom, Yerushalayim, Yishlayu, Shalom. So that there's an assonance of that Sha'ah, particularly in verse 6, with the wordplay of Yerushalayim here not only as peace, but as tranquility, yishlayu, which is also in assonance, in the same sound as sha'alu. Sha'alu yishlayu in verse 6. Ask for tranquility linked to Yerushalayim. And so the artistry of the psalm is that of sound, of motion, of the first three being forward, and then the couplets leading to again being not couplet, but prayer, looking to the future. Psalm 122 is an ode of love to a place. The image of places having anthropomorphic qualities, again, is a literary common device. But for Jews, as in this psalm, it's more than a device. It was a mindset of experience that when one is in our own day in Yerushalayim, one feels embraced by memory, as in this psalm, imagination, recounting of the past and bringing it into the present creates the moment of pilgrimage. But it doesn't stop there. The pilgrimage continues looking forward with what is possible, with Yerushalayim being the city that represents possibility. For only with peace, Maimonides says in his description of the Messianic era, can potential be actualized. And so the prayer here is, may there be peace and tranquility to enable a flourishing of presence, to experience God as ultimate presence. With that, an opportunity for you to share a thought or two, and then to have David and Linda say a word about their mother as we honor Sylvia Kaplan with our study today. I did have the privilege to be with my mother-in-law Sylvia in Israel on 2 of her visits, which were her first visits. So a couple comments and then we'll pull this together. Tanner Shula, a native of Yerushalayim.
Exactly. And that's why I wanted to first of all say that I feel this is a super personal psalm for me. And not only is it about my hometown, but I am old enough to remember the first Yom HaAtzmaut that we had in Jerusalem. Today being Yom HaAtzmaut, I was 7 years old at the time. And I remember the excitement. Grown men were weeping, the marching of the armies that had that victory going through the streets of Jerusalem, and the one tank with one cannon, Davidka, on it. I remember all that, and I do remember, and it really, I was thinking about it first thing waking up this morning, and I confess, I shed a tear or two at that memory. But I also am reminded that at that time, even though it was a glorious victory, nonetheless, we lost the togetherness of Yerushalayim. And I remember when we went back to school after the War of Independence was over, because schools were closed throughout the months of the war. Verse 3 of this particular psalm, Yerushalayim habnuya ke'ir shechubra la yachdav. We were taught that verse with sadness because we were not chubra la yachdav. Suddenly we were not. We were split. And like you said, like a lover who forcefully had been tossed out of the love relationship. So I feel an intense subjective personal experience. And I just wanted to mention, when you were talking about Shechubra La and the La being a little odd sticking there, it reminds me of where it says to Abraham, Lech Lecha. And this is almost kind of the same, Shechubra La. They're not necessarily translatable, but I think they just make a very strong statement that in his case, now you, Abraham, you go to where I send you, and here, you, Yerushalayim, you are a town to which all its parts are to be attached.
So let me, first, my hands go to my heart reflexively, both out of my deep affection for Shula, but also her linking all of us, wow, to a personal witnessing of Israel's first independence celebration that she was privileged to be part of as a 7-year-old. And for you, Shula, to link us to that moment of adults crying, overwhelmed with emotion of a dream realized, because this psalm, once again, we don't know when it was written, but it was written at least 2,000 plus years ago, which represents ongoing love, connection, and longing for a place as the symbol of Jewish homecoming and dignity and closeness to core of who we are as a people. And so you're bringing that memory is linked to this psalm with verses 4 and 5, in which this psalmist is recounting the past. And if that, in that regard, it's what we do whenever we go to Jerusalem. We point for there, that's where the tribes went up. That's where there was King David's palace. There is where there was the temple, because the place of Jerusalem is a melding of collective memory that we then become the conveyors of as we also look forward. And the last comment you shared, Shula, the la is in verse 3, Ke'ir shechubra la yachdav, a city that is joined to her together. And here, la, with a mapik, with a dot in the hay, which is possessive, la. It's a biblical move of this added sound of possessiveness, is identifying Jerusalem as her, not it. It can't be it also, because there is no it in Hebrew. But the feel of the psalm is her. She is the lover of God, the lover that is us as a Jewish people. We are intertwined with Jerusalem, and in the Sfirot, the Sphira of Shekhinah, of God's presence, is identified with Israel and is identified with this place as the meeting point of God, Israel, and the world. With that, because I'm mindful of time, I'm delighted that my sister-in-law Renee is here with her husband David and my wife Linda, as we together mark the end of Linda and David saying Kaddish, which is technically tomorrow morning, but as an opportunity to gather and honor Sylvia. And I invite Linda or David or Renee, just a couple sentences to link your mom with Israel. A thought? David?
Oh, I was looking at my sister. So, okay.
Oh, Carol is here too?
She was looking at me.
Is Carol here?
So, yeah.
I didn't see Carol. I just looked quickly. Carol and Alan. So Sylvia was privileged to be the parents of 3 children. One boy who's the youngest but speaks, and Linda and Carol. Go ahead, David.
So, all right. So, ironically enough, as you say, mom was blessed with many grandchildren, and I don't recall the age, Linda, or you can tell us, but she was the last one in the family to go to Israel, right? And she started doing things like that after our father passed away. And she was a pretty independent person, but they didn't prioritize it in that fashion. But when my father died, she started doing things like redoing the kitchen, or but she also started she took Hebrew lessons, right? And she went to Israel. And I remember after the trip, she would say things like, "Oh my God, I can't get over the place and get over, how clever these people are." And she would describe it in such a way, and she was just really impressed with, when you summarize it, she was just really impressed with the spirit, right, of Israel and the spirit of the people. So, and you could see this connectedness through the organizations that she supported, her artwork, her crafts, um, and just her home. And so, I would say that she was not only connected with Israel, but she was very much connected with her faith.
Thank you, David. As you shared that, I have this image of your mom's kind of inner strength, curiosity, and independence. In that, I have an image of her on a trip in Israel, maybe the second trip, with her in a wheelchair and pushing her in Caesarea on those cobblestones,
Yeah.
meaning she was physically with some limitation, but not limited to engage and experience Israel with fresh eyes. Linda or Renee or Carol, a thought? Just again, a minute, and then that'll lead to Kaddish.
I'll give a little context. The first time Mom came to Israel, we were on a sabbatical. We had gone from country to country. Before we left, she was nearly 80. My dad had passed away about a year and a half before. And before we left, Ellie kind of planted the seed. Well, maybe you'll come visit us. So we got an apartment. It was like a train car, so that she could stay with us. And when she got off the plane, what a delight. She just loved being there. She loved meeting people, and she'd get into all these conversations with so many people. And then when they'd leave, she'd turn to me and say, "Is he Jewish? Is she Jewish?" And I'd go, "Mom, it's a Jewish country." This is a woman who all her life worked at the synagogue, volunteered at the synagogue, worked with Jewish organizations. And in her mind, before she came, I think Israel was a refuge for the Jewish people. But to revel and delight in being in a Jewish country was such an experience for her. She really loved it. And it was so much fun sharing it with her and having her live with us for those few weeks. I wrote to her every day when we were traveling. And because she was with us during that time, I don't have a record of what was going on. I just have all those good feelings.
Thank you. Just give Renee. Did you want to add anything?
No, I'll leave it with Linda and David. They really represented everything that I was thinking so well. That even though it took her until later in life to get to Israel, it was always in her heart. And like David said, you saw it in the way that she lived and her home, and what she instilled in her children and grandchildren.
Thank you, Renee. I don't see Carol or Alan on the screen, but I will add, only because I'm looking at Renee on mine, that in terms of rebuilding of Israel, rebuilding of Jerusalem, Renee's brother, Mark Render, has lived in Israel for 40 years and is one of Israel's leading transportation designers, one of the people living in Jerusalem responsible for roads throughout the country and rail. With that, I'll pull together. It was wonderful to read 122, a psalm of pilgrimage on Israel's Independence Day, to go to that moment with Cantor Shula, describing that moment of recreation, and with Linda, David, and Renee, reminding each of us through the sharing of Sylvia's journeys to Israel, how we are privileged with goosebumps to be in a country whose rebirth is a miracle.